So now to the fun part. Yeah, welcome everyone. Today we have Dr. Greg Mittman with us, and his talk would explore a range of moral tales put forth to account for the origin and spread of the 2014 and 16 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, when conservation biologists, political ecologists, and Liberians were involved in different narratives. These assorted Ebola outbreak narratives review contested histories, politics, meanings, beliefs, fears, values, and rights that have shaped and will shape access to the natural resources in the area in a world threatened by deforestation, zoonotic disease, biodiversity loss, and climate change. Gregor Mittman is the Villas Research and William Coleman Professor of History, Medical History, and Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he's also guest research professor at LMU Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society. He's currently researching fragments of the Upper Guinean rainforest in Liberia and Guinea, and he's also involved in multimedia projects with 2 released films. Dr. Mittman has a PhD and a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Department of History of Science and a bachelor's degree in biology from Dalhousie University. We also have more information on him and his work available on our website if you're interested. But now on to this expected talk. Dr. Mittman, please, you can take over.
Great. Thanks so much, Paulina. Thanks also to the MSCL for inviting me. Thanks to those of you in the audience for joining today. This talk is part of a larger ERC project called Fragments of the Forest, Hot Zones, Disease Ecologies, and the Changing Landscape of Health and Environment in West Africa, that brings together an interdisciplinary team. This is us here: Musa Duno, Shavrit Kerwillan, Emanuela Roth, and John Fahey, in which we're collectively exploring the environmental, economic, political, and social forces, as well as knowledge regimes that have made the Upper Guinean forests of West Africa into an alleged, quote, hotspot, where biodiversity conservation, emerging infectious disease threats, and resource extraction interests converge. And our interest is not in reifying the hotspot, but really looking at how it came into being and the ways in which that designation has impacted the lives and livelihoods of human and non-human beings in that region. For my own part of the project, I'm exploring the history of 3 viruses: yellow fever, hepatitis B, and Ebola, over 100 years of viral research in West Africa, and the ways in which that research has remade alliances among living things in the Guinean forests of West Africa. And today I want to talk a little bit about Ebola. Now, in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, we're all, I think, familiar with what literary studies scholar Priscilla Wald calls outbreak narratives. Western news outlets quickly sensationalized Wuhan's wet markets, bustling with people, domestic animals, and wildlife as dangerous, quote, hotspots where viruses could spill from animal to human. Outbreak narratives and spillover stories commonly include moral discourses wherein nature's purity is polluted by matter out of place, as when viruses perturbed by human activity transgress species divides. Relatedly, powerful nations recurrently regard zoonotic diseases like Ebola or SARS as problems of the other. Such us versus them dichotomies help craft origin stories that stigmatize disease locales like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia, and disparage ways of being, such as bushmeat consumption or wet market customs. More so, the solutions powerful nations propose for these problems often rely on particular ecological ideas and resource management practices rooted in the history of colonialism, Western conservation, morality, and politics. So this afternoon, I want to dissect origin stories that arose during the 2013-16 Ebola epidemic in West Africa, the largest Ebola epidemic in history, which caused an estimated 28,652 cases and 11,325 deaths. The moral tales put forth to account for the origin and spread of Ebola are, to borrow the words of the ecologist George Evelyn Hutchinson, ecological theater and evolutionary plays. Upon examination, these fables wield contested ecologies of disease, land use, climate change, and species extinction within a shifting milieu of geopolitics, knowledge, and fears. They span geologic, forest, and human timescales, extend from the microcosmic to the global, and star a virus whose replication cycle is measured in hours and days, and whose longevity, whose ability to remain viable in a host, is unknown. So where does an outbreak origin story begin, we might ask? Perhaps with a patient zero like Emile Wamuno, a toddler living in a Guinean rainforest village. Until he and then family members succumbed, Zaire Ebola virus had not been identified in that part of West Africa. Or perhaps with a hollow ceiba tree that housed a bat colony. Emile allegedly played near the sacred tree before becoming infected. Mysteriously, the tree was destroyed by fire and its bat residents dispersed shortly before a team of investigative scientists arrived in March 2014. Or might disease origin be a tale of ecosystem rearrangement? In this scenario, deforestation, exacerbated by population pressure, war, poverty, subsistence agriculture, and industrial extraction, modifies human-animal contacts as occur hunting bushmeat. As described by journalist Jeffrey Stern in a 2014 Vanity Fair essay, Hell in the Hot Zone, ecosystem alterations destroy, and I quote, the buffer separating humans from animals and from the pathogens that animals harbor. Origin stories depict relations. Accounts of the 2013-16 outbreak link parasite with human host, virus with its suspected wildlife reservoir, village residents with their bat neighbors, human activities with the forest in which they transpire. Each tale offers a different framing of Ebola's ecology. The assorted Ebola outbreak narratives reveal contested histories, politics, meanings, beliefs, fears, values, and rights that have shaped and will shape access to the natural resources of the upper Guinean forests of West Africa in a world increasingly threatened by deforestation, zoonotic disease, biodiversity loss, and climate change. As the outbreak unfolded across Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, public health messaging aimed at preventing virus spread warned locals against hunting and consuming wild animals, particularly bats, chimpanzees, and monkeys. And these are three public health posters from Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. As the first deaths from Ebola virus struck the capital city of Monrovia in 2014, Vice News aimed at bushmeat consumption as a likely outbreak origin, targeting Lufi County, a Liberian bushmeat trading center near the Guinea and Sierra Leone borders. In the video report, the authoritative voice of American virus hunter Joseph Fair, then corporate vice president of Metabiota, a global viral forecasting company, and I'll return to that company later, asserts that the West African bushmeat trade poses spillover risks. Never mind that scientists had not located the strain of the Ebola virus responsible for the outbreak in any local wildlife sample. Human-to-human transmission, not multiple spillovers, spread the Ebola virus. Nevertheless, bushmeat played large in media-fueled outbreak fears. The August 29th Newsweek cover photograph of a chimpanzee with the headline, "A Backdoor for Ebola," hyped a story about smuggled African bushmeat in America. Anthropologist Adia Benton saw the cover as among, and I quote, old tropes of apes standing in for Black folks, while journalist Howard French saw the Ebola epidemic report as more ooga booga writing, in his words. The German National Weekly, Die Zeit, traced the outbreak catastrophe to the collision of, quote, nature and civilization, concluding that humans invaded the habitat of the virus. The villain in this disease ecology tale was neither the virus nor the bat, but the hunter, the bushmeat trader, the rogue that, in the words of anthropologist James Fairhead, was living on frontier zones and porous borders outside the reach of weak security states. Fears surrounding the Ebola virus during the 2013-16 outbreak were multiple. What writer Mike Davis calls the ecology of fear differed by locale. People living in the hinterlands of Guinea Forestière or Liberia's Mount Nimba region feared bans on bushmeat hunting and markets that threatened their livelihoods. People living in the capital cities of Conakry or Monrovia had other fears. For example, residents of Monrovia's West Point neighborhood feared further violent military enforcement of quarantine. Over time, fears can morph or entrench. In Ebola-affected areas, fear directed at an influx of doctors and nurses reflected not simple ignorance and superstition, as Western media claimed, but also the scars and painful memories of past medical encounters. Uninformed Western attitudes associating West Africa's equatorial forests with deadly diseases like malaria and yellow fever were a fear bomb primed for detonation and ignited by a 24/7 news cycle of Ebola sensationalism. Fear can be also a tool. Animal rights activists and wildlife conservationists saw advantage in anxieties surrounding bushmeat. Writing in the New Scientist, Tennyson Williams, Africa Regional Director for the World Society Protection of Animals, saw a silver lining in Ebola, a chance to, quote, clamp down on a practice which both causes disease outbreaks and empties forests of wildlife. Robert Young, a professor of wildlife conservation, sounded an even more dire alarm in the conversation. If humans continue to increase the items on their bushmeat menu, then we can expect more diseases like Ebola and HIV to appear, he wrote. Others, including a team of Imperial College conservation biologists, warned against using the Ebola epidemic as a, quote, Trojan horse to achieve wildlife conservation ends. Doing so, they cautioned, raised unfortunate associations with the long history of an outdated discourse of conservation in Africa that favored wildlife over people. Bushmeat bans imposed by the governments of Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone during the outbreak eroded public health's greatest tool, trust. Such bans contradicted generations of embodied knowledge and experience hunting and consuming wild meat in the upper Guinean forests of West Africa. Endemic trypanosomiasis, or sleeping sickness, has historically prevented livestock cultivation in the region, making wildlife an important protein source. Bushmeat also prevents food insecurity when drought, pestilence, or flood causing crop failure. Public health messaging that targeted eating bushmeat undermined the credibility of government and foreign NGO messengers and pushed the trade underground. Bans and alarming messaging also severely impacted lives and livelihoods, contributing to food and economic insecurity in the region. It would not be the first time that global concerns about zoonotic disease threats were used as a powerful weapon by Western NGOs to stigmatize forest use practices among local peoples in West Africa in the name of biodiversity conservation. And I want to step back in time now. In the early 1990s, the dangers of emerging viruses, underscored by the appearance of HIV/AIDS, Ebola, Marburg, and other novel pathogens, aroused alarm among scientists and the public. Like Homo sapiens, viruses and other microorganisms were responding to a rapidly changing world, where forest degradation, species extinction, urbanization, war, migration, and factory farming were altering life. In his 1994 best-selling book, The Hot Zone, A Terrifying True Story, Richard Preston accentuated fears that a growing human population in closer and more frequent contact with diverse life forms in the tropics would allow a deadly virus to jump the species divide to humans. In 1998, evidence of such a spillover and a resultant widespread epidemic made the cover of Nature. A team led by Beatrice Hahn at the University of Alabama used phylogenetic DNA analysis to posit that the HIV-1 virus, the main cause of AIDS, came to humans from chimpanzees in West Africa. Further, Hahn's group identified the West African hunting practice of killing chimps for food as the zoonotic transmission doorway. Their finding was based on conversations with Karl Amann, a Swiss wildlife photographer and conservationist who led a concerted and sensationalized campaign against logging and the bushmeat trade in Africa. Recently, this so-called cut hunter hypothesis was challenged by a group of anthropologists, historians, and virologists. Their 2021 book, The Histories of HIVs, convincingly rejects accounts of a single spillover event as the origin of HIV/AIDS. Rather, they argue, and I quote, multiple historical processes, ecological and geographical, economic and political, social and medical, enabled the virus to move from its simian reservoir, evolve, and spread among humans. The cut hunter notion was, however, a convenient argument for primate conservation. As Amann wrote in a pitch to National Geographic, and I quote, "I am today convinced that the virus angle is our last and best hope to turn the bushmeat issue into a crisis scenario as far as the public in the West is concerned." 7 years later, in 2005, virus hunter Nathan Wolff, conservation biologist Peter Daszak, and others marshaled further evidence in an influential paper to promote the links between zoonotic disease outbreaks, including HIV/AIDS, yellow fever, and monkeypox, and anthropogenic drivers, such as bushmeat hunting and logging in West and Central Africa. In biodiverse-rich regions, such as the Guinean forests of West Africa, viruses were known to jump from wildlife reservoirs to humans. But such one-off infections rarely resulted in human-to-human transmission. An increase in habitat fragmentation and human-wildlife interactions, they reasoned, also increased the likelihood of a human-adapted virus spreading through new viral traffic routes, for example, along logging roads that linked remote forest regions to urban centers. Wolff, Daszak, and their co-authors entered the paper with a bold claim, and I quote, "It is now becoming possible to conduct the science of predicting emerging zoonoses." Wolff capitalized on the markability of these insights, working the TED Talk circuit, tramping through Cameroon forests seeking bushmeat hunters and viruses, accompanied by CNN commentator Anderson Cooper, and founding the fundraising juggernaut Metabiota in 2008. By 2015, Metabiota had raised $30 million from investment firms specializing in data analytics, healthcare, and high tech. All bought Wolff's claim that virus hunting coupled with metadata analysis and computer modeling would predict where the next epidemic might erupt. Yet the company was widely criticized by WHO, Médecins Sans Frontières, and investigative journalists for bungling its response to the 2013-16 Ebola outbreak. Allegations including misdiagnosing samples and misreading the trajectory of the epidemic in Sierra Leone, where Metabiota had a lab, crude. Sylvia Blyden, special executive assistant to Sierra Leone's president, chafed at the company's claim to have provided critical support. "It is an insult to the memories of thousands of Africans who have died," she scoffed. Daszak also benefited professionally from prophetic science claims. Through conservation organizations like the Wildlife Trust, Wildlife Conservation, and EcoHealth Alliance, institutions critical to the formulation of the concept of One Health. Daszak proselytized the need to, quote, stress the zoonotic connections between human health and the emergence of diseases in wildlife, particularly in regions like the Guinean forests of West Africa, which in the early 2000s became identified as both a hotspot of biodiversity, as you see here, and emerging infectious disease threats. In 2008, Daszak jointly authored a letter in Nature that attempted to bring empirical evidence to his prophetic claims and significantly impacted the direction of U.S. federal policy and funding for researching pandemic preparedness. The authors analyzed data from more than 300 emerging infectious disease events that occurred between 1940 and 2004. Event occurrences were correlated with socioeconomic, environmental, and ecological factors. Human population density and growth, rainfall and species richness, and changes in land use, industrial agriculture, and bushmeat hunting were all factored in. Approximately 60% of emerging disease events were associated with zoonoses, the majority of which originated in wildlife. The highest concentration occurred in high-latitude developed countries, where the group argued human population density, antibiotic drug use, and industrial agriculture were major contributing factors. But these regions were not their concern. More robust disease surveillance in developed countries, the authors claimed, resulted in spatial reporting bias. Factoring out such bias, they determined that low-latitude biodiversity-rich tropical rainforest regions in Central and South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia were the highest hotspots for zoonosis and posed the greatest threat to public health. And this is a map from that paper identifying high-risk areas in red of zoonotic spillover for vector-borne diseases. And you'll see the way in which, again, the Guinean forests of West Africa light up in red here. Hotspots of emerging infectious diseases map closely with hotspots of biodiversity. The overlap signified regions at high risk for zoonotic spillover and species extinction. Protecting high biodiversity areas, Daszak hypothesized, reduced, quote, the likelihood of future zoonotic disease emergence. He and his collaborators urged a reallocation of resources for what they termed smart surveillance of emerging disease hotspots in tropical forest regions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Surveillance, they proclaimed, would identify potential zoonotic spillovers before they spread. In 2009, the United States Agency for International Development, acting on what Wolf, Daszak, and other scientists had been preaching for a decade, launched PREDICT. Over 10 years, the program spent more than $200 million, furthering research, strengthening surveillance, and increasing laboratory capacity, all aimed at discovering and detecting zoonotic pathogens at the human-wildlife interface. Implementing partners included Wolf's company Metabiota, Daszak's organization EcoHealth Alliance, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the University of California, Davis, and the Smithsonian Institution. PREDICT targeted places such as West Africa, seen as a biodiversity hotspot and an emerging infectious disease threat, where public health infrastructure and disease surveillance was underfunded and severely limited. This is a graphic from a fairly recent Washington Post article about virus hunting, and this is U.S. investment on pathogen research worldwide. You'll note how large West Africa is. The data has to be taken with a bit of skepticism because we inquired, and it also includes the amount of money that went to the Ebola response. So it's not just zoonotic disease surveillance. So it's why I think part of the reason why West Africa is so large. But in any case, it shows the ways in which West and Central Africa and Southeast Asia were targeted for the PREDICT program. More than 6,000 researchers in 30 developing countries were trained and engaged, unearthing an estimated 1,100 new viruses, but it all proved impotent to prevent what would become the largest Ebola outbreak in human history. As Ebola origin stories featuring spillovers and bushmeat hunting captivated Western media and some conservation biologists, an evolutionary epidemiologist at the University of Minnesota, Robert Wallace, and a professor of wildlife health and emerging diseases at the Royal Veterinary College, Richard Koch, looked elsewhere to account for the spread of Ebola virus, into the political ecology of industrial oil palm plantations exploding across West Africa. Wallace and Koch found the spillover story involving a bat and a boy to be problematic. In 2006, researchers at the Kenema Government Hospital Lassa Diagnostic Laboratory in Sierra Leone found antibodies to the Ebola virus in human blood, an indication of previous infection. Furthermore, as Liberian Minister of Health Bernice Dawn discovered, German researchers had detected Ebola antibodies as early as 1981 in blood samples taken in 1973 from workers on Liberia's rubber and iron ore concessions. Ebola infection was not as new or rare in West Africa as spillover origin stories implied. Farmers practicing slash and burn agriculture in West Africa clear a patch of forest, burn the felled trees to release nutrients, and then plant rice, cassava, and other staples and cash crops. When the soil is depleted, that patch is left to lay fallow for 15 to 20 years, and a new oat patch is open for planting. The temporal and spatial dynamics of such a system, Wallace and his collaborators suggested, acted as a kind of friction to a pathogen's evolution and spread. Before the Ebola outbreak began in Meliandou, Guinea, nearby expansion oil palm production had cleared 80% of forest cover. The large-scale clear-cutting for oil palm, according to Wallace and colleagues, may have, quote, lowered the ecosystemic temperature by which Ebola can be sterilized and controlled. In this narrative, a viral pathogen previously confined as sporadic fevers in isolated areas finds opportunity to incubate and spread. Spillover origin stories too often rely upon absolute geographies. The place of pathogen emergence thus becomes the site of causality and blame. Yet in this highly connected, interdependent, globalized world, no place is local. Global circuits of capital touch down in places like Meliandou, transform traditional agricultural systems, alter patterns of human and animal migration, and drive new alliances among living things. Wallace provocatively argues that following commodities and diseases as capital reshapes life potentially reverses causality. Not the virus, but capital, in his words, is the culprit. The view turns not West Africa, but New York, London, and Hong Kong, key centers of global capital, into three of the world's worst hotspots instead. On to yet another story of Ebola's ecology. At the height of the Ebola outbreak in October 2014, as people in Monrovia and in rural villages succumbed to the virus, the multinational company Bridgestone Firestone seized on tragedy to extol its presence in Liberia and to pitch yet another spin on the outbreak, the success of neoliberal approaches to global health and development. Firestone did what governments have not heralded international media headlines. Capital in this tale was the savior. Through a coordinated system of isolation wards, quarantine centers, and epidemiological surveillance, Firestone had just 3 Ebola cases on its 185 square mile rubber plantation in Liberia. A few weeks after President Obama pledged U.S. aid to Liberia, CDC investigator Dr. Brendan Flannery was asked what was needed. He replied, "More Firestones." But neither National Public Radio, which broke the story, nor Brendan discussed Firestone's complicity in creating Liberia's fragmented and frail healthcare landscape. Spotty and inadequate public health and medical infrastructure contributed to the Ebola deaths of thousands of Liberians, including contract Firestone workers who could not access company medical care. The uneven dynamics of Liberia's beleaguered healthcare landscape, as well as its fragmented forests, were rooted in a plantation economy built on parasitic relations of exchange. In 1926, Firestone secured from the Liberian government a 99-year lease for up to 1 million acres of land to grow rubber. To use a Liberian idiom, Firestone plotted the map for the wave of land concessions that would follow. By the 1950s, under President William Tubman's open door policy, the country had become a patchwork of rubber and iron ore concessions. And this is a map of current concessions in Liberia, foreign concessions, which have taken up 50% of land in Liberia. Foreign corporations, including Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, the Liberian American Swedish mining company Lamco, and the German-directed Bong Mining Company, were the primary drivers and investors in biomedical research and clinical care in Liberia in the post-World War II period. The promise of free medical care attracted able-bodied men and women as laborers to the plantations and mines, and won the support of Liberian elites, who were also afforded treatment. Little attention was paid by multinationals to building clinical and research capacity within Liberia. As a result, concessions became healthcare oases and what the late Paul Farmer described as the clinical desert of West Africa. The accumulating tinder of inequality, oppression, and resentment spawned by Liberia's extractive economy, which had made fortunes for foreign multinationals and a comprador Liberian class, became incendiary. Beginning in 1989, civil war tore the nation apart, impelled a mass exodus of educated Liberian professionals, and decimated the country's infrastructure. When the Ebola outbreak erupted, only a decade after peace returned to a country, Liberia had fewer than 200 doctors to serve its population of more than 4 million people. The Liberia government's initial response to the Ebola outbreak included roadblocks and barricades secured by armed military police. It rekindled the trauma of war. In West Point, Monrovia's largest and poorest slum, the August 2014 declaration of a state of emergency, accompanied by a gun-backed government cordon sanitaire, sparked confusion and riots. A teenage boy, Shaki Kamara, was tragically killed when police sprayed bullets into a crowd that had gathered to protest restrictions. In disenfranchised communities like West Point, food insecurity, dead bodies, state-sanctioned violence, and chaos plagued Liberians fighting what Emmanuel Yapawala Yuri and others described as, I quote, an invisible war. In 2014, Time magazine named Liberia's Musaka Fala an Ebola fighter of the Person of the Year. Fala gained the recognition in part for recognizing the ecology of fear contributing to human transmission of Ebola virus. Born into West Point's poverty, Fala grew up amidst the trauma of guns, violence, and civil war. Education became an escape route that led him to a PhD in molecular biology from the University of Kentucky and additional training in infectious diseases and global health at Harvard. In 2014, Fala was working for Liberia's Ministry of Health, overseeing disease surveillance, contract tracing, case management, and community mobilization for Montserrado County, where Monrovia is located. When Ebola cases appeared in West Point, fearful residents stormed and looted a makeshift holding center for infected patients. The unrest prompted the quarantine and its violent enforcement when resistance arose. Fala let the community of his childhood show him how to combat the outbreak of fear and virus. Crossing the military barricade each day, Fala put himself in harm's way, but allowed him to meet with community leaders and gain their respect. He and his staff listened to the community's frustrations, asked for their solutions, and followed their lead. From this approach, a model of community mobilization emerged in Liberia that eased tensions, built trust, and eventually brought the epidemic under control. When I interviewed Fala in 2019, he had tears in his eyes as he recounted the outbreak. Ebola is not easy, he said. As dark as Ebola was, it has given us a silver lining. That silver lining is the capacity to negotiate, the capacity to rebuild this country in research capacity that has never been before, he explained to me. Liberia's people, both living and dead, had given Liberia a resource, a virus. Fala and others were determined it would not be squandered. In exchange for aid to Liberia during the Ebola epidemic, the US government demanded that all collected Ebola samples be sent to the United States Army Medical Research Institute for Infectious Disease at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Liberian public health experts like Fala and Liberia Institute of Biomedical Research Director, Dr. Fatoma Bole, were not content to watch a valuable resource be extracted from the country once again without adequate and preferably long-term benefits for its people. Together, Liberia's Ministry of Health and the National Public Health Institute of Liberia established jurisdictional control over the 16,000 blood, plasma, semen, urine, and oral swab samples collected from Liberians during the outbreak. The proprietary claims relied on a 2014 protocol to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol on Access to Genetic Resources, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. It allows countries of origin to claim sovereignty over pathogens as a biological resource. Access to the Liberian samples now housed in the United States is controlled by a Liberia-led governance structure. Those seeking access must address how research will, quote, give Liberian opportunities to obtain advanced degrees or critical technology for the development of science and research for current and future generations of Liberia. The National Public Health Institute of Liberia has used its leverage to secure agreements with Western universities, government agencies, and biomedical firms to strengthen its public health surveillance and diagnostic facilities, and to help educate a new generation of Liberians in the study, treatment, and prevention of emerging infectious diseases. Fala insists, and I quote, the blood of the innocent people deserves their efforts to make sure that every drop is used to benefit this country. Fala describes with great pride how, where once you saw white American faces conducting clinical vaccine trials in places like Monrovia's John F. Kennedy Hospital, you now see only Liberian faces. Thus, a virus that emerged in the Upper Guinean forests of West Africa, devastating the region, has been mobilized by different actors to serve quite different ends. Conservation biologists seized upon Ebola's emergence and the associated fears to stigmatize bushmeat hunting in the name of biodiversity protection. Political ecologists employed the disease onslaught to critique the environmental and social impacts of industrial plantation agriculture sweeping across West Africa. Liberians have claimed sovereignty over the virus, attempting to overturn parasitic relations of exchange that have long plagued the country. These different sets of power and ecological relations all flow from and shape the actions of a virus in a multi-species world. And just to wrap up here. In the fall of 2020, in the midst of a COVID pandemic, National Geographic released Virus Hunters, a flashy TV episode that follows ABC News correspondent James Longman and Harvard epidemiologist Chris Golden around the globe to, quote, the front lines of viral research to hotspots where viruses are known to have emerged and where one could likely emerge again. They go first to Liberia. A 7-hour drive brings them to an unnamed location where we meet American veterinary scientist Jim Desmond. Desmond, in what I recognize as the Mount Nimba mining region, is with his Liberian Predict team, chasing bats and other wildlife in personal protection suits. Unassuming and charismatic, Desmond, with his Tyvek hood pulled down, his long hair sweat-drenched, explains how zoonotic diseases like Ebola have increased over the last 50 years. In 2016, Desmond, through EcoHealth Alliance, secured PREDICT funding to set up Liberia's first wildlife surveillance virus hunting operation. As the team prepares to enter the so-called cave where Ebola was found, Longman anxiously asked Desmond, "Is Ebola still in there? Is it still out here?" Desmond replies, "Probably." A fragment of Zaire Ebola virus RNA, isolated by Desmond's PREDICT team from one of 5,000 bats sampled during 2 years of study, begins an origin story. A story makes a place a hotspot. An animated map in the Nat Geo episode adds to this reification and naturalization of disease. Each region identified as a source of disease virus becomes an exploding red circle. Many red marks splash across West and Central Africa to depict Ebola's history on the African continent. Ebola, we are told, is a bat-borne pathogen, despite the scientific uncertainty around such claims. Fragments of the forest, like the Nimba region near the Liberian-Guinea border, are transformed by outbreak narratives. They become global objects of Western fear, attention, concern, and weirdly entertainment. Red, symbolizing heat, danger, and threat, heightens the drama. But in these kinds of hotspot visualization, scale is obscured. A red circle masks that the Nimba region, with its single Ebola virus RNA fragment, is 150 miles from Meliandu, where allegedly a bat and a boy began an outbreak. But scales of time and space affect both how ecological fables of disease are told and the futures that are made possible in their telling. The stories we tell build worlds. Thank you.